الحمد لله خالق الوجود من العدم وجاعل النور من الظلم فمخرج الصبر من الألم وملقي التوبة على الندم فنشكره على المصائب كما نشكره على النعم ونصلي على رسوله الأكرم ذي الشرف الأشم والنور الأتم والكتاب المحكم وكمال النبيين والخاتم سيد ولد آدم الذي بشر به عيسى بن مريم ودعا لبعثته إبراهيم عليه السلام حين كان يرفع قواعد بيت الله المحرم فصلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى أتباعه خير الأمم الذين بارك الله بهم كافة الناس العرب منهم والعجم. فالحمد لله الذي أنزل على عبده الكتاب ولم يجعل له عوجا، والحمد لله الذي خلق السماوات والأرض، والحمد لله الذي نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه، ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا، من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، ونشهد أن محمدا عبد الله ورسوله أرسله الله تعالى بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله وكفى بالله شهيدا، فصلى الله عليه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. أما بعد، فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم، وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها، وإن كل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. قال الله عز وجل في كتابه الكريم بعد أن أقول أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم: هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين وآخرين منهم لما يلحقوا بهم وهو العزيز الحكيم. ذلك فضل الله يؤتيه من يشاء والله ذو الفضل العظيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. اللهم ثبتنا عند الموت بلا إله إلا الله، اللهم اجعلنا من الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. آمين يا رب العالمين. When we look at any study of history, world history, then historians record the changing of events and how a society transforms from economic points of view, social points of view, political points of view, military points of view. And from these lenses, they did describe which nation went to war against which nation, what were the reasons behind it, what trade agreements were there, how did those trade agreements collapse, which ethnicity was which against which other ethnicity, their rises and their falls. Essentially, they're looking at these larger events in history, these, you can call them macro events in history, and they're making comments about them. And that's what, when we study documents in world history, we're really looking at a political history with, social and economic and other kinds of forces at work. And all of that's extremely valuable. The study of history is actually an extremely valuable study. You can think of what the Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that this ummah is kajasad. It's like one body. You may have heard this before. The Prophet described the entire ummah of Islam as one body. And if it's like one body, then we're all like one person. The imagery of the hundreds of millions, billions of Muslims is like one single person. And imagine that a person wakes up one day and has no memory of what happened yesterday or the day before. They have no recollection of anything in their history, that personal history. If a person doesn't remember, if I don't remember anything from beyond the last 24 hours, then I would say that I have no sense of identity, right? My identity is tied to my own history. Where was I born? Who are my parents? What is my religion? All of that stuff. So in that analogy that the ummah is like a single body, part of the implications of that is if we don't know our own history, then we don't know ourselves. We don't know who we are. But the problem, the other side of that, is that looking at history, there's two ways of looking at it. You can tell me your history as in, let's talk about a single person. You could describe your history as I was born in this place, then I went to school in this place. My parents did this job, and we had, we didn't have much money, or we came from this society, and then this happened in my life. You have a list of events in your life, opportunities in your life, the time you got married, when you had children, all of these things. That's your personal history. You can write a biography about yourself. But there's another kind of personal history. And the other kind of personal history is not from the point of view of the events, but from the point of view, how did Allah intervene in my life? What were the moments in my life that I know Allah did something for me, that I know it was from Allah? There were turning points in my life. This is your spiritual history, if you will, right? And even in your own personal biography, you cannot actually capture. You'll see that the spiritual dimension of your own history is completely missing. That is maybe if you're very intimate and close to somebody, right? If somebody just asks you about yourself, you're not going to tell them your spiritual history. You'll just tell them, hey, I went to college here, I live there, etc., etc. But if you become very close to someone, and you have a very deep, intimate connection with someone, then you can describe the moments you knew Allah did something for you. The moments you knew a turning point in your life, right? That changed the course of the rest of your life. Because they're really, one way of thinking about it, one of my teachers said it really beautifully. He said, there's two worlds. There's the world outside of you, and there's a world inside your mind, inside your heart. And sometimes the world inside of you completely changes. Even though the world outside looks the same, but you know something inside you has completely changed. And as a result of that, over time, your reality outside also changes. That is a very deep, insightful history that historians cannot capture. If you read history books, they cannot capture it. It's a very personal thing. What Allah does in the Quran is very interesting. He talks about our history, the Muslim history, not just from the, conquest and the major events and the big milestone chapter headings point of view. He talks about our history from a spiritual point of view. He talks about it in a way that no historian could ever talk about. I'll give you an example of that before we get to the ayah I want to talk to you about. So, a very famous battle in the history of the Prophet ﷺ is the Battle of Al-Ahzab, the Battle of the Trench. There are multiple tribes that have finally decided that we need to end the problem of Islam, so they form a conglomerate union, and they come all together not to meet the Muslims in the battlefield. They are going to come to Medina to engage in basically genocide. They will kill every man, woman, and child and take all the property because this problem needs to go away. We need to purify the land from these filthy Muslims. That's the idea. And the only thing that kept that genocide from happening, because we were completely outnumbered, was that there was a trench that was dug to not allow the army to make a massive incursion, right? And it was a very last minute trench that was dug. And I won't go into the details of that history, but the military that came for the invasion, they camped right outside the trench, trying to make because they can only now make trickled advances, right? They can't make a massive advance. So they're camped outside, and they're doing what in olden days used to be the siege. Like back in the day, if there's a fort that you're trying to conquer and you're not able to go over the walls, you just lay siege on the fort. They'll eventually run out of food. They'll run out of supplies. They'll start starving to death, and they'll give up. That's what's going to happen. So they're laying siege outside. And eventually then, the climate changed, there were storms, and they started running out of food supplies outside. And it became too expensive. And so they started losing motivation that we were wasting, resources. It's expensive to have a massive army sitting in the middle of the desert, and, financing them, feeding them, keeping them there became extremely difficult. And then the windstorms became, camps would tip over, fires would tip over, animals would die. And so they eventually just gave up and they left back. Okay, this is the history from a history book point of view. If you study a seerah book, you'll see all of this in more detail. But the way Allah talked about it in the Quran is none of what I just told you. He didn't talk about the digging of the trench. He didn't talk about the siege. He didn't talk about any of that. He said, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu dhkuru ni'matallahi alaykum. Those of you who actually have faith, and now already from the statement you already know, he's not talking to you, those of you who want to understand history up here, he says those of you who have faith. He's going to talk to you from a spiritual perspective. That's already been laid out from the opening of the ayah. He says, Udhkuru ni'matallahi alaykum. Make mention of the favor of Allah on you. The historian will never say this was a favor of Allah on... Anyway, he'll say the economic reasons, the climate reasons, the storm, these were but Allah starts by saying, make mention of Allah's favor on all of you. So he says, إِذْ جَاءَتْكُمْ جُنُودٌ, when armies came against you. فَأَرْسَلْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ رِيحًا وَجُنُودًا لَمْ تَرَوْهَا. We sent against them a wind, and we sent against them armies that you could not see. That's what Allah says. جُنُودًا لَمْ تَرَوْهَا, armies that you couldn't see. وَكَانَ اللَّهُ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ بَصِيرًا, and Allah had full view of what you were doing. That's really interesting. Instead of Allah saying Allah had full view of what the invading military was doing, Allah says Allah was watching not what they were doing, Allah was watching what you were doing. وَكَانَ اللَّهُ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ بَصِيرًا. إِذْ جَاءُكُم مِّن فَوْقِكُم وَمِنْ أَسْفَلَ مِنْكُمْ, when they were trying to attack you from above, because they were trying to scale the mountains from behind, and they were trying to come from underneath. Now this is the part that gets me. إِذْ زَاغَتِ الْأَبْصَارِ وَبَلَغَتِ الْقُلُوبُ الْحَنَاجِرِ. He says when eyes became deviated, like you're avoiding to make eye contact out of fear, and when your hearts were reaching into your throats. You were all having panic attacks. Your hearts were beating fast. You were palpitating. The hair on your skin was rising. Allah is describing not the state of thousands of people. It's almost like He's describing each and every person and their heartbeat, and each and every pupil dilating, and the eyes, how you looked at the enemy. Like that's the scene He's painting. This is not what you get in a history book. And if you read it in a history book, you'd call it fiction. Like this is an editorial, creative license that the historian took to add some spice to the story. But this is Allah, and how did He begin? He said, وَكَانَ اللَّهُ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ بَصِيرًا. Allah was in full view of what you're doing. Allah is describing to us, He has a view that you are not capable of. When we call Allah the all-seeing, He can see history in a way that we can't see. We can't record it. But He can. He can see what's happening on the outside. And now He's describing literally what I said before. There's a spiritual history, right? The eyes becoming dilated and the heart beating into the throat is what's going on inside of a person. He's describing the internal state. وَزُلْزِلُوا هُنَالِكَ ابْتُلِيَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ. This is how the believers were tested, and they were thoroughly shaken. Actually, this brief khutbah that I wanted to give you is not about the Battle of Ahzab. It's about Surah Al-Jumu'ah, something very brief. Because of the COVID situation, I stopped travel for some time, and I took this opportunity, and I'm very grateful for it that I'm here in Kosovo, as a place I've been wanting to visit for a very long time. And one of the things that happens when you travel is your mind opens up, and you think about things that you haven't been thinking about. Being confined in one place actually confines your thinking too. And as you travel and you see the open skies, your mind also opens up, and you think about things you weren't thinking about before. And one of the things I was thinking about is this ayah in Surah Al-Jumu'ah. Allah tells, a millennium and a half ago, this prophet who's in some no-name Arab wasteland that is not politically important. Nobody knows where Makkah is. Nobody cares. There's no oil yet, right? There's no superpower yet back in that time. It's just some few villagers that are having a problem with some other villagers. If you look at it from a political point of view, it's a skirmish. When we talk about battles of the Romans or the Danes or whoever else, you're talking about thousands of people. Tens of thousands of the Mongols or whoever else. Here you're talking about the Battle of Badr, like 300 people, 1,000 people. That's not a war. It's in history books, it wouldn't even make it. It's insignificant. Who cares? It's a who cares kind of history. If you look at it from the secular lens. What does Allah say about that has been contemplating? He says, He sent a messenger among you, هُوَ الَّذِي بَعَثَ فِي الْأُمِّيِّينَ رَسُولًا مِّنْهُمْ. He sent among the unlettered people a messenger from within them. Now, ummiyin is important for many reasons. The most important reason for now, for the purpose of this khutbah, is that these people were not known for their advances. They were not known because they were making a mark on the world. Everybody looked up to them. They were invisible to the world. You can think of the cultural impact of the Aborigines today, or how significant they are on the world scene. They're a small group out in the middle of nowhere that are isolated from the rest of the world, and we don't really know much. What goes on within them, their tribal wars within them, or disputes or whatever, nobody knows, unless you really want to go find out. Among those people that were invisible on the world map, Allah decides to send a messenger from among them that will recite Allah's ayat to them, that will purify them, that will teach them His law. He will teach them wisdom. And they had no clue before. وَإِن كَانُوا مِن قَبْلُ لَفِي ضَلَالٍ مُبِينٍ. But is this next ayah. He says, وَآخَرِينَ مِنْهُمْ لَمَّا يَلْحَقُوا بِهِمْ. And there are other than them, other than the Arabs, other than them, that haven't joined them yet. So now who is the them? It's the Arabs. And what does Allah want to do with what did He do with the Arabs? He says He sent them a messenger who gave him, he recited His ayat to them. He gave them Quran. By means of contemplating and thinking about this message, He started purifying their thinking, their internal state. The change inside of themselves started happening. And then He taught them the law and He taught them wisdom. That's the transformation that happened with them. That's their inside world completely changed. This was the process. And then He says, and there are others who are going to undergo that process and they haven't even joined them yet. لَمَّا يَلْحَقُوا بِهِمْ وَهُوَ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ. And He's the ultimate authority, all wise. In my brief time here, I've only been here less than a week. I've had some fascinating conversations about how Islam came here. Islam can come some places through da'wah. We can come to some places through conquest, by force even, historically, sometimes even by force. It came by hook or by crook. Sometimes it comes by, religion can spread by legitimate means, and actually the ugly history sometimes is not by the most legitimate means. Muslim history is not clean. It's not necessarily whitewashed. It's not a simple history. But the point from the secular history point of view, this happened and this happened and this happened, and that's why we're Muslim. From the Quran's point of view, you and I are Muslim today because this is the next ayah, ذَلِكَ فَضْلُ اللَّهِ يُؤْتِيهِ مَن يَشَاءُ. That is the favor of Allah that He gives to whoever He wants. He decided that you should still have Islam as an individual. He decided that you should be Muslim. This is about whether you pray or not, whether you know anything about Islam or not, none of that matters right now. All that matters is He made a decision in His wisdom that you and I as individuals should be part of this ummah. It doesn't matter which part of the planet we're in. We are the other than them that was talked about in this ayah. I love this ayah because it talks about all of the rest of the non-Arabs that haven't joined them. And then what does He do at the end of that ayah? Because if you know anything about reading Quran, you know that many ayat of the Quran, they end with some names of Allah. So this ayah ends with وَهُوَ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ. He says they haven't joined them yet, and Allah is the ultimate authority and wise. And what that does is it actually speaks to every individual who's Muslim since the time of the Prophet. Since the time of the Prophet ﷺ. What does it tell them? That I have behind me the authority of Allah Himself. Allah made an authoritative decision to allow me into this Islam. He made me a part of it. And there's a wisdom in why I'm Muslim. It's God's own wisdom, Allah's own wisdom, that dictated that I should be Muslim. And I should be part of this. And I should have, لَمَّا يَلْحَقُوا means they haven't joined them yet. And the word joining is also really interesting. That means that you and I, we may not speak the same mother tongues. We may not have the same cultural foods. We may not have the same kinds of histories. We may have, genealogical differences, cultural differences. Even in the way we practice our Islam, we may have differences. Even in that. But there's a Quran that we have in common. There's that revelation that he recited the ayat, right? There's those ayat we have in common. I'm talking to you about something. Any one of you, all of you that are Muslim, can say, what surah was that? I want to read it for myself. We're all going back to the same source. We're drinking from the same fountain. Doesn't matter which nation or generation we come from. The old and young, the European and the African alike. This is unlike anything else in the history of the world. Unlike anything else. So He says, ذَلِكَ فَضْلُ اللَّهِ. That is Allah's favor. يُؤْتِيهِ مَن يَشَاءُ. He gives it to whoever He wants. People, as men especially, when we get older and older, we love discussing politics. It's a thing. I do too. And in politics, we often discuss our differences. We often discuss one group versus another group. One tendency versus another tendency. One ideology versus another ideology. And what the Quran is describing is something that is so powerful, it overrides all of it and says, you have to start thinking about who is and who isn't the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You've been favored to join this ummah. And you have to feel a sense of connection to anybody else who says, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Like, it makes me happy to see progress happening in this nation, in this country. The development happening in this country. Education process, progressing in this country. Why is it making me happy? Because these are people of La ilaha illallah. They're moving forward. They have a bright future ahead of them. And I would want, when you see a success story one place, you take it to another place and say, hey, Muslims, we could do that here. If the Muslims in America living in Wisconsin somewhere or Ohio somewhere were doing something that somebody in Africa can use, some Muslim nation then they should use it. Put it to use. وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا. So what I wanted to be grateful to Allah for is the opportunity to connect with people around the world with something that is more powerful than anything else that is a sense of our identity. Of course, I'm from Pakistan originally. Being Pakistani is a part of my identity. I've lived a huge chunk of my adult life, pretty much all of my adult life in the United States. Being an American is part of my identity. My ethnicity is a part of my identity. My parents are a part of my identity. My education is a part of my identity. But there's a part of my identity that is it's more powerful than all of those things combined. And that part of my identity helps me connect with someone at a level that's deeper, that's internal, that's spiritual, even if I don't know much about them. And that is this Islam. That is the gift of Allah that He gave to you and me. That's what He's given us. And it's something that has to be restored. It has to be kept nurtured, and replenished, because we've lost that sense of ummah. I'll conclude, inshallah, with just something really beautiful that I want to share with you. That's recent experience of mine. I'm teaching Arabic online, and normally, if you're going to teach Arabic, it's a commitment, right? And people are busy; they've got work, school, family, all kinds of things. But Allah somehow decided that this COVID crisis is going to happen, and all the things that were keeping you busy shut down at the same time, right? So people that could never have made time for such a commitment started making time around the world. So now I'm teaching live Arabic classes for the Quran online, and there are thousands of students from around the world. I counted over 400 cities that are learning at the same time. And what I do sometimes while I'm teaching my live session is I say, so who wants to call from a video call during the class from Egypt? Or today, let's get somebody from Indonesia. Or today, let's get somebody from Kerala, India. Or let's get somebody from Uzbekistan. Or Kosovo, even the student was from Kosovo, actually. Right? And they're coming on, and they say something about themselves and where they're living, and they answer some Arabic questions. We're studying Quran together. And to me, it's the wildest thing you could ever imagine, that there are people that have no connection to each other. No possible connection to each other. And now they feel united with each other because of the same thing that Allah said was the favor of Allah that He gave to the Prophet, that united the Arab tribes that hated each other, and then He said others are coming that will join in. You literally see the world joining in. And then I get emails like, I have felt lonely my entire life, but when I'm in this program and I will listen to and I watch people come on, I feel like I'm part of something. I feel like I'm part of something. And that feeling shouldn't just come because you're in an Arabic class. That feeling should be there always. That sense of connection to the ummah should be there always. So I pray that Allah Azza wa Jal, He really restores that sense of connection inside us, and we're able to see the good in each other and capitalize on that good in each other and further each other in good in that spirit. So with that, inshallah ta'ala, I'll conclude. Barakallahu li wa lakum fil Qur'an al-Hakim wa nafa'ani wa iyyakum bil ayati wa dhikr al-Hakim. الحمد لله وكفى والصلاة والسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى خصوصا على أفضلهم وخاتم النبيين محمد الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. قال الله عز وجل في كتابه الكريم بعد أن أقول أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. عباد الله رحمكم الله اتقوا الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر ولذكر الله أكبر والله يعلم ما تصنعون أقم الصلاة إن الصلاة كانت على المؤمنين كتابا موقوتا.